you very much indeed. And I hope that everybody can hear me okay. Um, I am grappling like you with a very shockingly strange and fast-moving world. And I think that although most people thought that the election of Donald Trump in the autumn of last year would unleash change, most people thought that because in the first term, Donald Trump had not been nearly as dramatic in his actions as he had been in his words, that in his second term, there would basically be the same pattern playing out. And I remember very clearly talking to some Japanese officials late last year after Donald Trump had been elected and saying to them, "Are you worried about, things changing under Donald Trump?" And they were going, "No, because, last time round, nothing that dramatic and permanent actually happened. And we expect it to be the same this time round. There'll be a lot of drama and bluster and rhetoric, but nothing too dramatic will change." And I think that was the attitude of many business leaders and many European leaders as well, that they were battening down the hatches, to use that English phrase. They were taking some protective measures to basically go into hibernation, if you want, for a couple of years, but actually there wouldn't be a dramatic change in terms of the actual actions. Well, we're now almost 2 months into Donald Trump's presidency, and those predictions seem to be very wrong. And several things have become clear, which are basically very important for investors and business leaders to recognize. The first thing is that Trump, this time round, is dramatically better prepared than the first time. I spent quite a lot of time with the Trump administration the first time round, and they were very much, in shock at having won. They hadn't got much idea about how to govern. They were fighting amongst themselves. And as a result, a lot of what Trump thought he wanted to do simply didn't happen. But this time round, they've had several years to prepare, and they have been preparing very, very carefully. And they've made sure that in terms of the administration with Trump, two things are different. Firstly, or three things. Firstly, they are trying to operate through executive orders, bypassing Congress rather than using Congress. Secondly, they are essentially filling his team only with people who are perceived to be extremely loyal and willing to essentially sign up to his agenda. And thirdly, they have people for the first time who are essentially trying to impose some discipline on the group, like Susie Wiles, his chief of staff, in a way that frankly we haven't seen before. So it's quite a different type of administration this time round. On top of that, it's possible that this will be Trump's last administration, and that will mean he can basically act with less concern about pleasing voters. It's not entirely clear that is the case. Ideas are being floated to try and extend his term, but that's also playing into how people are perceiving it. So there's a difference in the mode of execution this time and the level of preparation. But the other big difference is that this time round, there's also a very clear-cut vision that some, and I stress that some, not all, but some of his advisors are working with that really does have the potential to play into the topic of this talk, which is the shifting world order. And very roughly speaking, the way that this vision works is that they believe that in the post-war era, when essentially initially there was the Cold War that split the world into the communist world, the Western Alliance, dominated by America, and then the non-aligned groups, that essentially that system, which was after World War II, ran for several decades. And then, when essentially the Cold War collapsed, China entered the WTO, and you began to have the integration of the global economy, and America became essentially hegemonic. They believed that that system, although it seemed to be very beneficial to America, was also very dangerous for America. And they think it was dangerous for America for two reasons. Firstly, they think that the patterns of global cooperation that shaped the post-war era across the world were not so much about cooperation and America using all of the tools to create soft power and build alliances in a way that benefited America. They see it as very, very exploitative. And they think that America was essentially acting as a global policeman and also, most critical, um, essentially accepting massive capital inflows into America alongside accepting large trade deficits in a way that essentially was pushing up the value of the dollar, hollowing out the American economy, and hurting its industry in a very negative way. These ideas are very, very counter to the way that most orthodox economists see it, but they think that the type of imbalances that have been building up in recent years have been very damaging to America and the American economy and the heartland. And even though the American economy seems to have boomed in recent years on the back of the tech innovation revolution, they don't see a particularly vibrant and healthy economy at all, surprisingly to many people. And they also see an enormous pile of debt, which is threatening to drag America down. And by they, I'm really talking about the people directly around Trump who have been thus far setting economic policy. And those are people like J.D. Vance, the deputy, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, and Stephen Moran, the Council of Economic Advisors, and a group like that. The second thing that also shapes their thinking is that they are convinced that essentially this very distorted, uneven pattern not only makes a mockery of the ideas of David Ricardo around trade, but also has enabled China to rise very rapidly in a way that they think is going to threaten America in the future. So they see Russia as a partial threat, but also potential ally. But they see China, above all else, as the biggest single threat to American power. And they think that if they don't act to try and correct what they regard as these imbalances, then essentially they're going to be eclipsed by China quite soon. So their position is driven partly out of a sense of supremacy, but also, oddly enough, through a sense of insecurity and fear that actually, although America might seem very strong to the outside world, and although they think that America has the power to bully others, they also feel that it might be quite fragile unless they act now. So that shapes their vision of how the world is working and developing. As I say, as far as they're concerned, the theories of David Ricardo around trade are no longer valid. They say that Ricardo is, quote, dead. They think that the entire global financial and trading system is wildly dysregulated and imbalanced and cannot be sustained the way it is. They're worried about debt and they're worried about the rising threat of China. So when they look at the world, they essentially, the easiest way to make sense of it is to use the framework that Goldman Sachs used to teach its new trainees, which is to separate out the idea of goal, strategy, and tactics. Goal, strategy, and tactics. And so the team is driven by the goal of making America great again, which is actually more an instinct and meme. And that's kind of the emotional vision that drives Trump. He's not a details person. He has this vague goal of making America great again, which is not defined. And by the way, the idea of what great means is very unclear because through much of the post-war period, people thought being great meant showing moral leadership on the world stage. To them, being great means being strong and supreme. But so the goal is broadly to make America great again. The strategy is to try and rework the global financial and trading system, or to do what Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, calls to look for a new type of Bretton Woods agreement, a complete realignment of the financial and global trading system. People sometimes talk about them trying to create a Mar-a-Lago Accord, a bit like the Plaza Accord that came out 4 decades ago to basically weaken the dollar. In fact, the parallel with the Plaza Accord is too modest, because they're not trying to just affect the value of the dollar. They have much bigger ambitions to try and change the wider financial and trading system. So it's more like Bretton Woods. But that's a strategy. And then the tactics, the specific tactics they're trying to use to do this revolve around tariffs, revolve around being as unpredictable and aggressive and capricious as possible to put everyone else on the back foot and the defensive, because they think that will bring people to the negotiating table. It revolves around the idea of constantly cutting partnerships wherever you can. So no one is permanently your friend or your enemy necessarily. And it revolves around the idea of using financial and military and economic and technological might all together. So, in sharp contrast to the vision that dominated in the middle to late 20th century, which tended to see economics as being separate from military and tech and financial factors or trade or politics, for them, it is all jumbled up together. And they do not think you can separate out any aspect of that at all. So, to give one tiny example, Scott Bessent has said in the last few months that there have been 6 global reserve currencies or reserve currencies in history. Every single one, including Portugal, by the way, every single one, he says, has involved military dominance. So you can't, he says, separate military dominance from reserve currency status. And as part of that, he has floated ideas like demanding that countries which receive military protection, like Saudi Arabia, like Japan, like Taiwan, should be encouraged, i.e., forced, to swap some of their holdings of treasuries or gold or dollars for long-term or perpetual dollar bonds to enable America to finance its debt using the long-term end of the yield curve. That's essentially either a restructuring or a forced default, depending on how you see it. Some of the rating agencies view that idea as a potential default. And that is a concept which is completely unimaginable a few years ago because you're mixing military power and essentially debt dynamics together. But that's typical of the way that they're trying to jumble all of these issues together. Or to cite another, even more radical idea that probably will never happen, but it's being discussed. When they're thinking of creating a sovereign wealth fund. They would use America's stock of gold, which they would revalue at market prices. So that would go from a very low value to a huge value, leveraging it up, and then using that pool of money to go and buy assets around the world which were not American, both in order to extend America's power, but also because they want to try and rebalance the inflows of capital into America by purchasing assets outside America. And they hope that that would help weaken the dollar and in some ways counteract the fact that all these inflows have been strengthening the dollar. So, I was chatting to one person a few days ago who said, well, we could use a sovereign wealth fund to buy Greenland. Or, if they won't sell Greenland to us, then maybe we can buy Novo Nordisk, the weight loss, the Danish company that makes the Ozempic drug. And when I said to them, well, why the hell would the Danes possibly want to sell themselves to you? That would be crazy. They came back and said, well, we can use all kinds of threats like the currency. The krona is isolated. We can impose capital controls against the krona, and they will come around pretty quickly. So it's a jumbling up of all the different elements. And the really important thing to understand is that as they unleash these tariff moves, um, although they're starting with traded goods and tariffs, it is highly likely that they will move to financial links and money as well, because for two reasons. Firstly, if you look at where the source of hegemonic power is today for America and the world, it's actually not manufacturing. That lies with China. And hegemonic power in the tech sector is still being contested. But where America does have hegemonic power is in relation to the dollar-based financial system. And so they are very likely to use that to try and shore up their power. And they're also going to be fighting very, very aggressively to try and defend that. Of course, the other reason why they are likely to look at capital markets, financial flows, is that, in many ways, the fact that you've had big American trade deficits has gone hand in hand automatically with capital imbalances too, and huge amounts of money flowing into America. And although economists have traditionally thought that was very good, in fact, some of them are actually starting to argue it's not good at all, and you need to curb that. So is any of this going to happen? Well, you can read their ideas in publications like a big memo written by Stephen Moran that some of you may have seen called A User's Guide to Restructuring the Trading System. I've included the links to that in a recent column. And I have another column going up tomorrow about some of this tomorrow morning.
Mm.
So there's actually plenty of, material out there which can basically teach you what they're trying to do. And Scott Bessent himself has also given interviews which outlines a lot of this. Um, but the key thing to understand about whether or not it's going to happen is this. These ideas, this grand reordering of the global order, is really being spearheaded by a fairly small group. They're very influenced by people like Michael Pettis, the economist, and they do have quite a coherent worldview. And their ambition to try and refashion the New World Order is really striking. It's on a par with the kind of big intellectual shifts we saw with John Maynard Keynes back in the post-war years in the middle of the 20th century, or with the rise of neoliberal economics in the 1980s with Thatcherism and Reaganism. It's a big intellectual shift. Whether it happens, we just don't know, because Trump has at least three factions around him who are fighting each other. One faction is the national populists, people like Stephen Bannon. Another is the techno-libertarians, people like Elon Musk. And then there is a faction who are linked to the congressional Republicans, like Mike Johnson. And although the three of them are aligned very closely in some respects, they're not aligned in all respects. And it's possible that if the markets crash, if there's a sign of a populist revolt, if events change, Trump may be forced to change his course. He may sack some of these people and blame them for things going wrong. He may scale back his ambitions. That is entirely possible. But I think that is what is important to say is that nobody should discount the scale of ambition in the ideas that are circulating amongst some of them. Nobody should ignore the fact that one of the other ideas that's driving their vision is that they want to they want to ask countries to divide themselves into a red, yellow, and green bucket, i.e., to sort out whether they're going to be America's foes, like China or Iran, whether they're going to be America's friends, um, or whether they're going to, which by the way includes groups like Argentina, or whether they're going to be in a kind of orange indeterminate bucket where you cut transactional deals. I suspect that at the rate we're going, Europe will be in that orange bucket. And I think that three-part categorization, classification, and division of the world in America's view is going to stay there for a while. But the key point I want to leave you with is that the global order that we have all built our careers on and grown up with, the post-war global Western order, is dead. We don't know exactly what is going to come out instead. I think the hope of going back to where we were before is going to be very, very forlorn. Don't bet on us going back to where we were before. You need to try and imagine this as being an intellectual shift of the sort that happened with Keynesianism or Reaganism or other big swings in the past. We don't know exactly how it's going to play out in terms of international relations, but the situation is very fluid. And the last thought I'll leave you with is that this may feel very scary, very uncertain, but like all big changes in history, it would produce huge opportunities too. So buckle up. Jaime, I think you're on mute.
Jaime, está sem som.
Have here. Okay. Thank you, Matthew. It was, as usual, a perfect keynote. Then we were having, as it was supposed, a discussion. The idea is that we have some insights back from states. Luís Neves, you are here with us. You have a great experience in terms of international relations, dealing with the Asia, with the America, and things like that. Do you want to make any comments or questions to what Gillian told to us?
Well, thank you, Jaime. No, I think it was very good. Thank you so much. It was amazing. I do share what you said, but the question in terms of the opportunities that you mentioned, where do you see them? So because you have been reflecting about this, what kind of opportunities do you see ahead of us?
You mean at a micro level or macro level?
Macro level.
At a macro level. Well, at a macro level, to me, one of the biggest consequences of what has happened is that Europe has had such a shock that the possibility of reform in Europe is finally looking more likely. And the history of Europe and the European Union in the last few decades is that unless there's a crisis, nothing changes. It's very hard to get consensus and a sense of urgency without a crisis. And Europe now faces a real crisis because not only is it facing threats from the East, from Russia, which in my view are not going to go away anytime soon, but the transatlantic alliance is now very contested. And it's very clear that Europe is going to have to act on two fronts. One is to essentially shore up its military systems very rapidly. And we've seen Germany already announce that in a startling way. And it's possible that we're going to have military-style Keynesianism emerge, which will finally give a boost to growth because of the spending associated. Secondly, it's possible that because of the economic threat from America, and in particular the dynamism of its tech sector, we will finally see Europe get serious about trying to raise its productivity and business dynamism, and in particular adopt some of the extremely sensible ideas in the Draghi report. So those are really the macro opportunities that I see right now, most significantly for Europe, that for the first time ever, the one thing that they can all agree on inside Europe is that they hate Trump. They're horrified by what's happening in America. They recognize the economic threat. I mean, one of the consequences of America no longer wanting to import as many goods is that the pie which European companies can sell into is shrinking. China is not exactly operating like a big buyer of last resort either. So Europe has to get really aggressive and nimble right now to respond. And that may end up being a big silver lining from all of this horror.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. Luis, it's okay. But we have here Katia, that is someone that is living in Portugal and has a global overview about what's happening in the world. Katia, do you want to make any question or comment to Gillian, please?
Well, good evening, everyone. And Gillian, thank you very much for such informative and interesting reflection on the current situation. So I just have actually two comments I would be very curious to hear your opinion about. We've been, for past decades, we were focused so much on globalization and creation of economic interdependencies in order also to secure peace. So what happens right now and what is most shocking, and we need to make this, as you call it, intellectual shift, is to understand this kind of principle to ensure security, which was grounded on economic relations, is being destroyed and or heavily damaged. So my first question, what is your view? What can come instead in non-military terms that can provide some kind of an alternative to these principles that could ensure the peace and reduction of geopolitical conflicts by using some economic means? And the second question is actually, I'm very curious about the tariffs. So we see that tariffs is used kind of a threatening tool towards outside world by getting some economic interests or other interests by US. But if we think properly, some of these measures, wouldn't it actually bounce back and hurt US consumer? Because you can't internalize all the industries, all the products, you know, and substitute with domestic production. I can assume that for certain categories, you have a huge increase in consumer prices for consumer goods for Americans. How is it being seen?
Well, those are both extremely important questions. On the issue about the inflationary pressures in America, most economists who are not Trumpians assume that this is going to raise inflation quite sharply. And they point out that voters will not be happy, least of all because Trump was elected promising to cut inflation. The Trumpians disagree. They say that actually inflation is likely to fall for three reasons. Firstly, they want to unleash a lot of deregulation that they think will cut inflation. Secondly, they want to essentially unleash massive expansion of the oil and gas sector, and they think that energy prices will fall as a result. And thirdly, they think that essentially a lot of the tariff pressure will be absorbed by the countries that sell goods to America and or by currency forces. So that is their theory. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but that's their theory. We don't know what's going to happen. What we do know is that in the first Trump administration, when some tariffs were imposed, in fact, inflation didn't surge. So that's one reason, again, why the Trumpians don't think it's going to happen. It was a very different context. But, we just don't know right now. And in terms of, what is the alternative that's going to create security if the idea of economic integration doesn't? Again, we just don't know right now. It seems that the most effective way to have security against Trump is either to have something he really wants. So Taiwan may try and essentially use that tactic with its advanced chips, or to be able to stand up to Trump very strongly, or to flatter him endlessly. The British have been trying to do the last tactic, with moderate success, not total success. But, the idea of being able to use economics to buy political security is no longer valid, alas.
Okay, perfect, Gillian. So let's going on to another question. So we have here lots of people that I think that are going to have some questions.
Okay, I've got until 10 past the hour or so, and then I have to run. So
how much do you have in time?
I've got about 15 minutes, and then I have to head out, I'm afraid.
Yes, of course. Okay,
Yes,
so
10, 15 minutes,
I'm
yeah.
going to try to manage the situation on that. Okay, so let's see. I think that Katya already made a question about what you have been doing. So I think that from people they have here, I think it would be interesting to have Marcela is someone that is working in Portugal and he has Brazilian relations. Marcela, do you want to make any comment or question to Gillian, please, about all these questions? I don't know if you...
Jaime?
No. You are speaking with who? Sorry.
Jaime, may I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Hello, Gillian. Thanks for your presentation here. I would like to know what's your opinion, and why can't we sign a treaty, and I say we, European Union, with Ukraine regarding rare earth minerals? Because I think, as you said, we have to try to attack Trump where he possibly can have interests. And I think it would help promote growth in Europe because Europe is going to continue to finance and even replace the US in the support for Ukraine. And I would like to know your opinion on that.
I think that's a brilliant idea. I couldn't agree more. I've been to Ukraine many times, including during the last couple of years. And I've long been baffled why the Europeans were not being more aggressive about trying to go in there and develop the rare earth minerals. I wish the European leaders would literally be charging in there right now and offering to invest, aggressively seeking to try and develop those minerals, and essentially working with the Ukrainians to do that. So I strongly agree. Why haven't they? It's partly caution, timidity. It's partly, the problem with Europe is an inability to take rapid decisions and be super aggressive and a lack of capital. But no, I strongly agree.
Okay, we'll have you with us, Fernando Freire Sousa.
Thank you.
Fernando, you are
By the way, I was
expert.
meeting with a businessman, an Indian
Yes, okay.
businessman just yesterday, who was saying, Ukraine is fantastically cheap. Anyone who's involved in mining anywhere in the world should be diving in there, and they're looking at it very aggressively.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So we have here Fernando Freire Sousa, that is an expert on European studies, and he is also professor of economics. Fernando, do you want to make any comment or question to Gillian, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. for your very very interesting presentation. I would like to ask you on one side to elaborate a little bit more on the three parts world that you were explaining us during the presentation. Uh, and in those three parts world, where does um, Russia and the military questions fit, if they fit in some sense? And what do Trumpists, in fact, think about the role of Russia in all this uh,
But the
architecture?
Trumpists think several things. Firstly, they're very clear that China, not Russia, is the main threat. So, insofar as they are focused on Russia, it's really for two or three reasons. Firstly, because they want to peel Russia off from China and stop Russia and China acting together too closely in a way that can threaten America. So they really want to try and separate Russia off from China. Secondly, they see Russia as a lesser power and they don't want to be embarrassed or challenged or threatened by Russia or by anybody really. And then thirdly, as a small corollary, they think that they could strike economic deals with Russia. And they think that, Russia is not worth them wasting a lot of energy and money on because they think it's really Europe's problem. And they tend to have, a rather imperialistic view of the world. I mean, and I used to say 6 months ago that Russia was the only imperial power that was still being super imperial because everyone else had basically grown up and stopped being so imperial. And now you've got America going back to being totally imperial. It's horrific. But the way that some of them see again the world is these three poles or blocks of influence: China in Asia, Russia, Europe, and then America, North America. And they talk a lot about Fortress America, trying to create Fortress America surrounded by sea, which basically means everything from not quite Latin America up, but pretty much. The other thing to know about their view towards Russia is they are obsessed with the North Pole. They think the North Pole is going to be the new great game, because it's got minerals and it's got land and it's also going to be the future sea channels due to climate warming. So they're really obsessed with the North Pole. And one of the reasons why they keep talking about Greenland is because it's kind of in the way. And one of the reasons they keep talking about Canada is because that's also totally in the way. I mean, the inconvenient reality is between them and North Pole, leaving aside Alaska, there is Canada. And that kind of is a problem in their eyes. And the fact that Russia is also there in the North Pole, again, is critical. So that's how they tend to see Russia. In terms of how they use these buckets of red, yellow, green, we don't actually know where many of the countries will end up sitting, and they may move because they're transactional. Iran, China at the moment, anyway, North Korea, those are seen as being in the red bucket. Hungary, Argentina, probably in the green bucket. Who knows? But then you've got a lot of other countries which are very unclear. And Russia, one presumes, is in the red bucket, but they don't see any reason why they can't strike transactional deals with countries in the red, orange bucket, as they go along.
Okay, perfect. Ana Rodrigues Gonçalves, you are dealing with innovation, technology, and science. Do you want to make any comment or question to Gillian?
Yeah, just a small question. Gillian, it's great to listen to you. It's my first time that I'm listening to you. Do you believe that markets can recover for this big fall of the last days? And do you believe we can recover this year? Or what should as investors can do? Because everybody in the world is losing.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the first thing to say is they are falling from a very, very high level. So one of the things that influences the thinking of people like Scott Bessent and others is that the markets have surged. And so they're falling from a very high level. And they think that pain can be tolerated to some degree. point one. Point two is they do want to try and counter the financialization of the American economy in recent years that they think has been created by excessive capital inflows and focus more on the so-called real economy going forward. And point three is that although they think that when they've reorientated the economy, you'll get a much healthier economy that will support stock market rises in the long term, that in the short term, it's very clear that a number of things they're doing could create a recession, could create pressures on the stock markets. So it's not just the fact that they're introducing tariffs, which are creating potential supply chain shocks in a big way. It's also because if they do impose any type of capital controls, capital taxes, which is probably going to be their next move, that's going to cause pressure on the stock markets too. And I think one of the reasons why the stock markets are falling is not just because of tariffs. It's not just because of recessionary threat. It's also because they're threatening to tax Chinese investors who put money in America. And so some Chinese are going and getting out. So I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think a recovery is going to happen that quickly, but we'll see. Who knows? And I can take one more question and then I'm going to have to head off, I think.
Yeah, can I go?
Yes.
Yeah.
Josh Gomes, yes, of course.
Okay.
And
Thank you,
after
Gillian.
that, we conclude. Okay.
Okay. Well, what about the Great Britain? Where is it standing? Is it standing side by side Europe? Is it standing side by side the US? I mean, what's going on in the UK?
Well, it's standing very uncomfortably, is the honest answer. If you are being optimistic, one of the silver linings of this crisis, this shock, is that Britain's relationship with the European Union may well get better because they will be forced together. And the European Union, frankly, needs military energy that Britain can provide. And there's a desperate need to basically collaborate in terms of defense much more effectively. And there's also hope that Britain's traditional role as acting as a bridge between America and Europe might actually become even more important. That's a hope. And Britain is trying very hard to avoid being targeted by Trump by pointing out that it doesn't have a big trade surplus with America. On the contrary, it's actually a deficit country too. And most of the flows between America and Britain are in the service sector above all else, which thus far Trump doesn't seem to care about. He's very old-fashioned. He seems to only care about metal bashing factories and car factories and things you can touch and, like that. He doesn't seem to have noticed that services matter. And Britain is very much a service sector economy. And of course, Britain's also got a lot of financial links. So thus far, Britain is not too much in his sights. And Britain also has a lot of cultural capital that he appears to care about, like the king. Go figure. But, it's possible that will break down, that relationship. It's possible that trying to straddle Europe and America will prove impossible. And Europe may be forced to cling together so tightly in response to Trump that integration in a financial sense, an economic sense, may accelerate dramatically around the euro and throw up a model that Britain doesn't want to be part of. So we don't know.
So, Gillian, do you have another time for last question or
very quickly, I've got literally about 2 minutes max.
So, Graça Emília, last question, and then we conclude with this question. And thank you very much for this opportunity. It was fantastic. Graça, please.
It was already asked, in fact, by Anna, because it was basically with all the CEOs being together with Donald Trump. How do you think they are reacting exactly to the losses in the stock market? That was exactly my question, which I thought was already addressed by your.
Okay.
Yeah, they're trying to. I mean, the business community is trying to rein him in, but they're terrified, and they're not speaking out right now. That may change, but at the moment, you know, they're keeping their heads down. So listen, thank you very much indeed. Obrigado. And I hope.
Gillian, so the next time we'll do this in Portugal. We'll invite you to Portugal, and it will
Absolutely.
be a great opportunity. It was fantastic, and all of us will read your articles in FT, and we're with you. Thank you very much. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank
Bye
you.
bye. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye bye.
Obrigada, Jaime. Sempre bom.
Obrigado.
Bye
Thank you.
bye.
Bye bye. Bye.
Até breve. Obrigada.
Okay.